My grandfather's funeral photos move when no one looks. I didn't even want to touch the frame. I just stood there in the doorway of my grandfather's old house, holding my phone out like a weapon, the little LED shaking so much the light quivered across the walls. The photo on the floor shouldn't have been there. It had been hanging straight on the wall when I went to bed. Now it was lying just a few feet from my door, face up, the glass reflecting my trembling hand. But it wasn't the fall that stopped me cold, it was his eyes. In the funeral photo, my grandfather had been facing the camera, stiff and formal the way those portrait-style shots always look. But now, under my flashlight, his eyes weren't looking at the lens anymore. They were angled toward the hallway like he was watching something just out of frame. The house was dead quiet. No wind, no furnace. Just that heavy, suffocating silence old houses get at night, when they feel more like something alive than a place to live. I kept listening for footsteps, for breathing, for anything that would explain how a sealed photo frame could change on its own. My pulse was pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the real sounds, those soft, deliberate thuds I'd heard before I opened the door. I whispered, "Grandpa," without meaning to. It just slipped out, like my voice was trying to find anything human in that moment. The photo didn't move again, but the reflection on the glass shifted, like someone passed behind me. I froze, staring at that tiny warped glimmer of motion. I know how insane it sounds. I know no one believes me when I try to explain what happened in that house. But that night wasn't the beginning. It was the moment everything finally snapped. And it all started with the week he died, and the funeral photos none of us should have brought back into the house. I was 27 when all of this happened, drifting through that weird in-between stage of life where you're too old to be irresponsible, but still too young to pretend you've got anything figured out. I had just been laid off from a tech support job and was living in a tiny downtown apartment above a nail salon, the kind of place where the walls vibrated every time someone below me turned on the massage chairs. I didn't have much going on, so when my mum called and said my grandfather had passed, I told her I'd help with whatever she needed. I think part of me felt guilty. I hadn't visited him as much as I should have, and that was the truth. His house was in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by woods that always smelled damp even in the summer. 3 acres, a sagging porch, a metal roof that pinged when acorns fell on it. It was an hour from the nearest real grocery store and maybe 10 minutes from the closest neighbour's driveway. I used to love that place when I was a kid. As an adult driving up the long gravel path, I felt something heavier sitting in my chest. Not dread exactly, just that weird pressure you get when you step into a home that suddenly has no one living in it anymore. My mum had already set up the funeral photos in the entryway. 4 of them, all in identical dark frames. They were from the viewing, those stiff, overly lit portraits they take at the funeral home for families to display. I tried not to stare at them too long, but it was hard to avoid them. No matter where you stood in the house, it felt like one of them was catching you from the corner of your eye. The first day was normal. I spent the afternoon cleaning out the garage, tossing rusted tools into piles, sipping cold gas station coffee from a cup that kept shedding its cardboard sleeve. The house smelled like cedar, old carpet, and the faint hint of cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls after decades of my grandfather's habits. The floors creaked in spots I'd forgotten about. The furnace kicked on so abruptly it made the windows buzz in their frames. I kept catching myself listening too hard to the sounds around me, like I was waiting for someone to walk into the room. I told myself it was grief mixed with being alone in a place that used to feel full. But the silence in that house wasn't peaceful. It was thick, heavy. It felt like something resting right against the base of your skull. If you've ever stayed alone in an old family house after someone passes, you know the feeling I'm talking about. That strange, guilty familiarity. You're surrounded by their things, their routines, the little habits they left behind, but there's no one there to animate any of it. You don't know where to stand. You don't know what drawers you're allowed to open. Every object feels like a relic you shouldn't disturb. The only thing that made me pause was the basement door. It wouldn't stay shut. I push it closed, hear the latch click, walk away, and a few minutes later I'd look over and see it half open again, like someone had forgotten to pull it all the way shut. There was no draft, no tilt to the floor. It was just one of those annoying quirks old houses have. but it still made me wedge a chair against it that night before I went to bed. Not because I thought anything was down there, I just didn't want to see it open again in the dark. Before I went upstairs, I passed the funeral photos again. Something about them made me slow down. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe grief plays tricks on you. Maybe the lighting was different. But one of the frames looked off. Just a little. Like the angle wasn't quite the same as earlier. I stared at it for a second longer than I meant to, shook it off, and headed up to the bedroom I used as a kid. Nothing truly strange had happened yet. Not really. But as I lay in bed listening to the wind hitting the siding, I remember thinking the house felt smaller than I remembered. Like the walls had shifted inwards after all those years of holding their breath, waiting for someone to come back. I had no idea then how quickly the place would stop feeling empty and start feeling watched. The next morning I tried telling myself I'd slept fine, even though I kept jolting awake every hour to the sound of something small clicking or tapping somewhere in the house. I blamed the heating pipes, the settling wood, my stupid brain, anything but what it felt like someone pacing slowly from room to room, stopping outside my door every so often before moving on. I made coffee in the old percolator my grandfather kept on the stove, the thing sputtering and hissing like it was struggling to stay alive. The kitchen window looked out over the backyard and the tree line beyond it, and for a minute I just stood there, trying to settle into the quiet. It didn't work. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was too expectant, like the house was waiting for me to notice something. I walked through the living room on my way to start sorting paperwork, and that's when I saw it. One of the funeral photos looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not enough that you'd gasp and say, "Oh, that's impossible." Just subtly off. My grandfather's head was turned a little more toward the right than I remembered. His eyes were no longer squared with the camera. It was like he was glancing past the photographer's shoulder. I stood there staring at it longer than I should have, trying to remember the exact way it had looked the day before. Memory is unreliable, especially when you're grieving, so I made myself shrug it off. Maybe my mum had dusted it and nudged it, or maybe I had. Or maybe I'd just imagined the whole thing in the weird haze of being back in that house. Around noon, I moved to the hallway to box up old coats and shoes. When I looked back into the living room, the frame was now angled toward the staircase. I froze with a pair of boots halfway into a trash bag. I hadn't touched it. I knew I hadn't touched it, but I forced myself to rationalize it anyway. Houses shift, floors slope, frames slide on slick surfaces. There are 100 logical explanations. I repeated them like a prayer. But still, every time I walked past that display, something prickled along the back of my neck. By evening, the house felt too dark, even with every lamp on. The shadows seemed heavier, and every creak startled me more than it should have. I tried to distract myself with leftovers and some mindless scrolling, but a strange tension kept building in my shoulders, like I was bracing for something to happen. Later, while brushing my teeth, I heard it, a faint tapping. So soft I thought it was my imagination. It came again, a tiny precise click like a fingernail tapping glass. It wasn't the pipes, it wasn't the house shifting. It sounded close, too close. I went still, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, listening with my breath held. The sound stopped. The house went silent in that suffocating way it does when you're waiting for something to move. I forced myself to finish brushing, turned off the light, and stepped into the hallway. Everything looked normal, but the air felt wrong, heavier, like the humidity before a storm, even though it was a cold night. As I was heading to my room, something in the corner of my eye made me turn back toward the living room. The funeral photo was tilted, not just angled a little, not nudged, tilted sharply like it had been pulled forward and let go. I stood there staring at it, my heartbeat climbing into my throat, and told myself to get a grip. It was just a picture frame, just a piece of wood and glass, nothing more. But when I turned away and climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something. That the photo wasn't just tilting on its own, that it was turning towards something. I woke up at 3 a.m. to a soft scrape in the hallway. And this time I knew I hadn't imagined it. The scrape woke me up like someone dragging a fingernail across the floor. Not fast, not sharp, just slow enough to make my skin crawl. I sat up in bed and held my breath, listening. The house wasn't settling. This wasn't pipes or wind. It was a deliberate sound, like something, or someone, moving just outside my door. When I finally worked up the nerve to open the bedroom door, the hallway was empty. But the photo on the wall closest to the stairs was tilted again, and this time it was angled inward, facing down the hall like it was watching for something. I reached out to straighten it, then stopped. My hand was shaking, and I hated how afraid that made me feel. I walked away instead. By the next afternoon, the changes weren't subtle anymore. Every time I left a room, the photos shifted. One would lean slightly forward, another would turn toward a doorway I'd just walked through. I started marking the positions of the frames with tiny pencil lines on the wall, just enough for me to see if they moved. And every time, the marks didn't line up when I came back. Sometimes it was a millimetre, sometimes more. I kept trying to rationalise it. Maybe vibrations from walking were nudging them. Maybe I hung them crooked when I dusted. But it got harder to lie to myself when the frames were pointing in directions that didn't make sense, like toward the basement door or toward the top of the steps or toward my bedroom. Around that time, I heard the tapping again, not once or twice, but a pattern. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 more. It didn't sound like something hitting the outside of the glass. It sounded like something tapping from inside the frame. That became the motif, the thing that started eating at me the most. The tapping that seemed to follow me around the house. If I was in the kitchen, it came from the living room. If I walked into the living room, it shifted to the hallway. It didn't happen constantly, just often enough that I started anticipating it, listening for it in the quiet. Sleep stopped being restful. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sound of the frames shifting ever so slightly on the wall. Sometimes I heard what sounded like a fingertip sliding across the glass. Once, I heard the unmistakable creak of a frame being lifted just a fraction of an inch, then set back down. One afternoon, as I walked past the living room mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but nothing was there. When I checked the mirror again, I saw the reflection of the hallway photo. For a split second, I could have sworn my grandfather's face wasn't angled the way it was in the real frame, like he'd been looking at me directly in the reflection before turning away. I tried calling my mum again. She told me I needed rest, that grief can twist memories and shadows into things that feel real. I wanted to believe her, but she wasn't the one hearing tapping behind her in an empty house. That evening I caught another faint change. All the frames were angled toward the same spot, the basement door, the same door that kept drifting open. I felt something cold spread through my chest as I stared at them. It was like the house, and whatever was inside those photos, was trying to tell me where to look. Later that night I stepped out of the bathroom and froze. The photo at the end of the hallway had shifted again, but not just slightly this time. It was turned completely toward my bedroom door, facing me straight on. The eyes weren't looking off camera anymore. They were staring into the hall, into the darkness where I stood. That was the moment everything inside me tightened like a knot. I knew it then, with a certainty that left no room for denial. Something was in that house with me. Something that understood movement, attention, and timing. Has anyone listening ever seen a picture frame move on its own? Because I need to know I'm not the only one. It was my last planned night in the house, and I remember telling myself that once I made it through until morning I'd be done. I'd pack up whatever I could fit in my car, tell my mum the rest would have to wait for the estate company, and never set foot in that house again. That thought should have made me feel relieved, but instead it felt like I was leaving something unfinished, like the house knew I was planning to walk away. The rain started around sunset, soft at first, then heavier, hammering against the metal roof in waves. By 10, it sounded like the whole sky was collapsing on top of the woods. The power flickered twice while I was brushing my teeth. The second time, it stayed off for a few seconds, long enough to feel the darkness press in around me. When the lights finally buzzed back, I felt this strange heaviness crawl up my spine, like something had entered the house during that brief blackout. Around 11, the power went for good. Everything went silent except for the storm. My phone was only half charged, and the flashlight felt like a thin thread keeping me connected to reality. The air smelled like damp wood and dust. I could hear the house expanding and contracting under the pressure of the rain, but underneath it was something else, a slow, dragging sound on the first floor. I stepped into the hallway and held my phone out over the railing that looked down into the living room. The beam shook in my hand. Something wooden was scraping across the tile. A chair? A table? No, it was too small, too deliberate. The hairs on my arms rose before I even realised what direction the sound was coming from. The funeral photo display. I moved down the stairs one at a time, listening. The tapping started the moment my foot hit the bottom step. Slow, rhythmic, like someone testing their knuckles against glass. Then it spread the way rain rolls across a roof. First one frame, then the next, until all four were tapping in a staggered pattern, each slightly out of sync. It wasn't frantic, it was patient. That made it worse. When my flashlight passed over the frames, my breath snagged in my throat. They had moved again. All four were turned toward the hallway that led to the basement, angled inward, like they were pointing. Or beckoning? I whispered, "No," out loud, almost involuntarily. The tapping stopped. Then the basement door creaked open. Not a quick swing, not a soft drift. It opened with a slow, steady push, the kind you'd expect from a person bracing their weight on the other side. Cold air rolled out from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs. The smell was earthy and damp, like the inside of a root cellar. My flashlight trembled as I aimed it toward the doorway, and for a second I was sure I saw movement, something pulling back into the dark. I stepped backward, bumping into the wall. The frame closest to the basement door leaned forward, only by a few inches, but enough that it shouldn't have been physically possible. Frames don't bend like that. They don't hover in mid-air before settling. Something shuffled up the first step, a heavy, dragging foot, then another. My throat went dry. I bolted up the stairs, nearly slipping on the old carpet runner. I slammed my bedroom door shut and threw my weight against it like a kid hiding from a nightmare. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it might rip through my ribs. My phone flashlight flickered, then steadied, casting shaky shadows across the walls. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then the tapping started again. But this time, it was right outside the door, not on glass, on the wall. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 more, knuckles. I could feel the vibration through the wood against my shoulder. Something dragged across the hallway carpet. Not hands, something heavier, something that didn't care about being quiet anymore. I backed away from the door, not daring to make a sound. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint crackle, like glass under pressure. My stomach dropped. A frame was being lifted, or squeezed. A moment later, something slammed into the bedroom door hard enough to rattle the hinges. The photo, whichever one it was, hit the floor outside. I heard it slide across the carpet and stop right at the threshold, like it was being placed there. Another slam, louder, closer. I stumbled back until I hit the far wall, gripping my phone so hard my fingers cramped. The door shook again, and the glass outside cracked with a sharp, splintering pop. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. No tapping, no dragging, no breathing. The hallway outside fell into complete silence, the kind that feels predatory. I stayed pressed against the wall for what felt like an hour, flashlight aimed at the door, waiting for the next thing to happen. But nothing did. The storm eased, the house settled, and the silence became something else. A warning, not a threat. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. I just sat there in the dim glow of my dying phone, watching the door, knowing that whatever had come up those stairs wasn't finished with me. It was only waiting for the next chance. When the sky finally lightened, it didn't feel like morning. It felt like the house had just stopped holding its breath long enough for me to escape. I didn't open the bedroom door until the sun was fully above the tree line, and even then I did it slowly, like something might be waiting with its ear pressed against the other side. The hallway looked untouched at first glance, normal, still. But the framed funeral photo nearest my door was lying face down in the carpet. The glass wasn't broken, and when I picked it up it was warm, warmer than it should have been. I dropped it immediately without meaning to. It landed with a soft thud, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint tapping from inside the frame, so quiet I couldn't be sure. I didn't even bother packing the rest of my things. I shoved whatever was already in my backpack on top of my clothes from the night before, grabbed my keys, and walked out without looking back. I didn't lock the door behind me. I didn't close it all the way. I just needed to be outside, away from the walls and the stillness and that awful, pulsing feeling the house had at night. My mum wasn't happy when I told her I couldn't finish helping with the estate. I didn't give her details. I just said I wasn't going back inside. She assumed I was overwhelmed with grief and said we'd handle the rest later. I let her believe it. I wasn't ready to explain something I couldn't even understand myself. I filed a police report a few days later, telling them I thought someone might have broken in while I was staying there. The officer who took the report walked me through the usual questions, and I could tell from his face he didn't believe anything happened. No signs of forced entry, he said after checking the place. Old houses make noise. I wanted to tell him about the tapping, the shifting frames, the footsteps on the stairs, but the words stuck in my throat and I realised how insane it would sound out loud. Back at my apartment, I couldn't sleep. Every night, just as I was drifting off, I'd hear a faint sound from the living room. Not loud enough to be alarming, just enough to jolt me awake and leave me staring at the ceiling until dawn. I kept the lights on for the first week. Then I started leaving the TV on, anything to fill the silence. I couldn't handle quiet anymore. Silence reminded me of the house, of the way the air felt when the frames moved. I stopped hanging pictures on my walls. Every time I picked up a frame, I'd get that same crawling sensation along my arms, like the memory of cold air spilling from the basement door. I put all my photos in a drawer, even ones of my family, especially ones of my family. Months passed before I went back to my mum's house. She'd already sold most of my grandfather's belongings, packed away the rest, and moved on the best she could. When I walked down her hallway, I stopped dead without meaning to. One of the funeral photos was hanging there, right between the coat closet and the bathroom. The same dark wooden frame, the same glossy print. And on the back, so faint you'd miss it unless you were looking closely, were the pencil marks I'd made in the old house to track the movement. My stomach dropped. I asked her why she took that one. She said she didn't remember grabbing it. Thought it must have ended up with her stuff during the packing. She said it never moved on her wall, not once. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to argue. I just stood there staring at it, realising it was angled ever so slightly toward the staircase. When I left her house and pulled out of the driveway, I looked back in the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw someone standing in the living room window, a shape, a presence, maybe just a reflection. When I looked again, it was gone. That night, back in my apartment, I was making dinner when I heard it. Just one single tap, on glass. I froze, knife still in my hand. The sound didn't repeat. It didn't need to. It came from the drawer where I'd hidden all my photos. I've tried convincing myself 100 different ways that what happened in that house was grief, or stress, or some kind of sleep deprivation hallucination. It would be easier to believe that. It would make my life simpler. But every time I settle on that explanation, something small happens. A knock on the wall, a shift in a reflection, a sudden cold draft in a room with the windows closed, and I'm right back inside that hallway, staring at a tilted frame and feeling something watch me from the dark. The part that bothers me most is how familiar it all felt. Not like a haunting, not like some ghost story you hear around Halloween. It felt personal, intimate, like whatever was in that house already knew me. Like it had been waiting for me to come back. I don't know if it was my grandfather or something tied to him, or something he kept in that house without meaning to. I still don't understand what it wanted. A warning? A message? Or just attention? People say photos capture a moment, freeze it forever. I don't believe that anymore. I think they're windows, thin ones, and sometimes whatever's on the other side presses close enough that you feel it breathing against the glass. I don't keep framed pictures around me now. I can't. Even the idea of setting one upright on a shelf makes my chest tighten. I stick to digital photos on my phone, but even then, I catch myself checking the angles of faces, the direction of the eyes. I zoom in more than I need to. I look for things that shouldn't be there. A week ago, someone left an envelope outside my apartment door. No return address, no note, just my name written in shaky pen. Inside was one photograph. Glossy, heavy, familiar. It was my grandfather's funeral portrait. only this time he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking past my shoulder at something behind me. And when I turned around, the hallway behind me was empty, except for the faint sound of glass settling, like a frame being nudged into place.